my dear child. The cup you have been standing with is too small for what I just released upstream. And if you do not bring a bigger one before the water reaches your channel, the overflow will spill past a vessel that was shaped by drought rather than designed by the God who controls the dam. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about your cup being wrong. It is about your cup being small, shaped by the empty season, narrowed by the pain of watching a wider vessel hold nothing for so long that the width itself became the wound, and the wound produced a decision to shrink the container to a size that hurt less when it was empty. The shrinking was survival, but the water being released is not a survival-level volume. You have been functioning on less joy, less provision, less hope, less expectation. Each reduction was a narrowing of the channel, a deliberate, grief-driven, pain-avoiding constriction of the passageway through which good things were permitted to reach your life. The narrowing made the empty season tolerable, because a narrow channel holding nothing hurts less than a wide channel holding nothing. My beloved child, the dam just opened, not the trickle valve that releases enough water to sustain a narrow channel during a dry season. The dam, the full unrestricted flood volume release of everything that has been held behind the wall upstream while your channel was being narrowed by the experience of drought. The volume coming downstream exceeds the channel you are currently maintaining, and the instruction is not a rebuke. It is a preparation. Bring a bigger cup. Widen the channel. What is coming cannot fit in the container the drought built. Stay here. What I reveal next is how much was released upstream, and why the volume was held back until this specific moment. Type widen the channel if you have been functioning on less, having narrowed every expectation to match the empty season's reality, and God just told you the dam upstream was opened at full volume, and what is being released exceeds the capacity of a container whose size was determined by drought rather than designed by the one who controls the water. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts, and when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct, click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The dam was not opened partially. It was opened at full release, which means the volume of water traveling downstream toward your channel right now is not proportional to anything the drought season's narrow passageway was designed to receive. My beloved child, I need you to understand the difference between a trickle release and a dam release. A trickle release matches the channel's current capacity, sending enough water through the passageway to fill what the passageway can hold without exceeding the walls the channel currently maintains. A trickle release respects the channel's size. A dam release does not. A dam release sends the full volume regardless of the downstream channel's width, because the dam release is determined by what is behind the wall, not by what is below it. What is behind the wall determines the volume, not what is below it. My dear one, what has been held behind the dam during your dry season is not a trickle's worth of provision. It is the accumulated volume of everything that was meant to flow to your channel during the drought, but was held at the dam. Because the channel's narrowing during the drought would have wasted the volume by allowing it to overflow past walls too narrow to contain what was being sent. The holding was not withholding. It was accumulation, and accumulation released at full volume produces a flood that trickle-calibrated channels cannot contain. This message was not released for everyone, who has been going through a dry season. This was aimed at the one person whose specific channel was narrowed by the specific pain of watching a wider passageway carry nothing for long enough that the narrowing felt like wisdom. The person who does not know that the dam upstream has been accumulating the full volume of their dry season's withheld provision, and that the release just happened, and the water is now moving downstream toward a channel that must be widened before it arrives. Type full release if you just realized the dam was opened at full volume. Not the trickle that matches the narrow channel's capacity, but the accumulated total of everything that was held upstream during the drought, and the water moving downstream exceeds anything the grief-narrowed passageway was built to contain. I have been watching you narrow the channel since the drought began, and the watching has been the specific ache of a God who controls the dam upstream, and has been holding a volume behind the wall that the channel being narrowed below was making increasingly unable to receive. My dear one, not from downstream observing the narrowing as a completed fact, from upstream, at the dam, watching the volume accumulate behind the wall while the channel below was constricting. In response to the same drought the accumulation was being held for. The volume grew while the channel shrank, and the growing and the shrinking happened simultaneously. My beloved child, I watched the specific moments the narrowing occurred. Each one corresponded to a specific disappointment. The first narrowing was small, a minor constriction in the channel's width produced by the first season, where the expected provision did not arrive, and the channel that was built to carry it sat empty. The small narrowing was a reasonable adjustment, a practical response to a dry channel maintaining a width that the current flow did not justify. The subsequent narrowings were larger, each one produced by a deeper disappointment, each disappointment teaching the channel that the width it was maintaining was not matched by the volume it was receiving, and that maintaining width for a flow that was not arriving was the architectural equivalent of holding open arms for an embrace that never came. My child, the holding open was the wound, and the narrowing was the wound's response. I chose you for this message because the dam's release was timed to the moment the narrowing reached the specific width where one more constriction would have closed the channel entirely. The narrowing was approaching a threshold, the point where a channel that has been narrowing incrementally reaches the width, where the next narrowing produces closure rather than constriction. The release was authorized one narrowing before the closure, and the water is coming. Type 1 before closure if God has been watching the channel narrow with each disappointment, and the dam was released at the exact moment the narrowing was approaching the threshold, where one more constriction would have closed the channel entirely, meaning the water is arriving one narrowing before the passage would have sealed itself shut. I know what the empty channel has been doing to the specific part of you where your willingness to expect good things is stored. My beloved child, an empty channel is not merely an absence of provision. It is an ongoing, daily look-at-the-dry bed experience, whose repetition produces a specific erosion in the part of a person's identity that governs the size of what they permit themselves to want. The wanting is the width, and the width has been narrowing because the wanting was producing the specific form of suffering that occurs when a wide desire meets a dry channel, and the gap between the two generates a pain the person eventually decides is not worth sustaining. The pain was real. The narrowing was the response. My child, I watched the narrowing happen at the wanting level, not just at the expectation level. Expectation and wanting are different dimensions of the channel. Expectation is the height of the walls, how much the person believes will arrive. Wanting is the width of the bed, how much the person permits themselves to desire in the first place. The drought reduced both. But the wanting reduction was the deeper cut. Reducing expectation says, I do not believe it is coming. Reducing wanting says, I no longer let myself want it to come. The wanting reduction is the wound beneath the wound. Because a person who still wants but does not expect is a person whose channel is narrow but open. A person who has reduced the wanting itself is a person whose channel is narrowing at the bedrock level. The level where the very capacity for desire is being constricted by the pain of desiring things that the dry channel has never delivered. You reduce the wanting, not just the expecting. And the reduction at the wanting level is what brought the channel to one narrowing away from closure. Because wanting is the foundation the channel is built on, and reducing the foundation reduces everything above it. The deepest wound the drought inflicted was not the empty channel. It was watching other people's channels run full while yours carried dust, producing the specific conclusion that the dam upstream distributes based on a worthiness your dry bed reveals you do not carry, my dear child. You watched them, the people whose channels were carrying water, whose provision arrived at volumes that justified the width they were maintaining, whose lives seemed to confirm that the dam upstream releases to channels that deserve the flow, and whose receiving made your not receiving feel like a verdict on the channel rather than a season in the schedule. Their full channels became evidence for your empty one, and the evidence wrote a verdict. My beloved child, the verdict said, the dam releases to the worthy and withholds from the unworthy, and my dry bed is the diagnostic that reveals which category I belong to. The verdict did not announce itself as a verdict. It arrived as a feeling, the low grade, always present, too quiet, to arg, with feeling that the provision in other people's channels was confirmation of something they possessed that you did not. The feeling narrowed the channel faster than the drought itself. I watched the feeling produce the most dangerous narrowing of the entire season. The narrowing that occurred not in response to the channel being empty, but in response to the comparison between the empty channel and the full ones nearby. The drought-driven narrowings were painful but manageable. The comparison-driven narrowing was devastating because it attacked the wanting at the identity level, telling the channel that the wanting itself was the problem because wanting what the dam does not released to you is wanting above your allocation. My dear one, there was no allocation system. The dam was holding your volume while their volume was released, because their channels were not being prepared for the same flood yours is about to receive. Type no allocation if you narrowed the channel based on the comparison between your empty bed and their full ones, and the verdict that said the dam distributes by worthiness just collapsed because the holding was never about allocation but about accumulation, and the volume being released to your channel now exceeds what the full channels beside you were ever designed to carry. The narrowing was never the correct response to the drought. It was the pain's response to the drought. And pain and wisdom produce different channel designs. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the narrowing from the classification of wisdom the pain assigned to it. Your system classified the narrowing as maturity, as the responsible adjustment of a channel whose width was not justified by its flow, as the practical engineering decision that a person makes when maintaining infrastructure for a volume that is not arriving becomes an expenditure the pain budget can no longer sustain. The classification sounded wise. The classification was pain, wearing wisdom's language. My child, wisdom would have maintained the width. Not because wisdom ignores the drought. Because wisdom has access to information, the pain does not. The information that a dam upstream is accumulating the volume, the drought is withholding. and that the accumulation produces in a future release whose volume will require every inch of the width the pain is currently narrowing. Pain sees the dry bed and narrows. Wisdom sees the dam and widens. The drought was never evidence that the channel was too wide. The drought was evidence that the dam was accumulating, and accumulating dams do not release trickles. They release floods, and floods require channels whose width exceeds what the drought season's flow would justify, because the width is not being maintained for the current flow. It is being maintained for the coming one. My dear one, the channel was originally built at the width the coming flow requires. The original design, the width I drew before the first drop of provision, was released or withheld, was calibrated to the flood volume, not to the drought volume. The narrowing that the pain produced was a reduction from the flood-calibrated width to the drought-calibrated width. And drought-calibrated width cannot contain flood volume release. The original width was the correct width, and the original width is what the instruction to bring a bigger cup is restoring. The water just became audible, and the specific, upstream getting louder, cannot be mistaken for anything else. Sound of a dam's full release. Reaching the first sections of the downstream channel is traveling toward your narrowed passageway at a speed the drought never produced. My beloved child, something shifted within the last few days. Not in the channel's width, in the atmosphere around the channel. A moisture, a humidity that was not present yesterday, entering the air above the dry bed with the specific atmospheric quality that precedes the arrival of water in a channel that has been carrying nothing but dust. The humidity is the water's announcement, and the announcement arrived before the water itself. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens when a dam's full release enters the first sections of a downstream channel. The water does not arrive at the narrowed section immediately. It fills the wider sections first. The portions of the channel between the dam and the narrowing that were built at the original width and that receive the initial volume without overflow because their width matches the release. The wider sections are filling right now, and the filled sections are pushing the water toward the narrowed portion where your channel constricted during the drought. I have been preparing this release behind every season of the drought, while the channel was narrowing and the wanting was reducing, and the comparison was producing the verdict, and the pain was wearing wisdom's language. I was at the dam, monitoring the volume, accumulating behind the wall, calculating the release date, ensuring the total volume held back during the drought would be sufficient to produce the specific flood level provision, that the instruction to bring a bigger cup is preparing the recipient to receive. My child, the volume behind the dam is more than you imagined. Not because your imagination is small, because the accumulation happened across the entire drought. And drought-length accumulation produces flood-level volume. Type water audible if you have felt a moisture entering the atmosphere around your life. A humidity that was not present before, and the sound of water approaching from upstream is the dam's full release, filling the wider sections of the channel and pushing toward the narrowed portion where the drought constricted the passageway you are being instructed to widen. The cup you thought was empty is about to overflow, and the title carries that specific sequence because the cup was never permanently empty, but was temporarily unfilled during a drought whose dam was accumulating the volume that the overflow requires. My dear one, I need you to understand the precision of the word overflow. The title does not say the cup will be filled. It says overflow, and the distance between filled and overflow is the distance between a volume that matches the container and a volume that exceeds it. Filling matches the cup. Overflowing exceeds the cup, and what is being released from the dam upstream is not a fill-level volume. It is an overflow level volume, whose excess is the instruction's entire point. Bring a bigger cup because the current one cannot hold what is coming. Not because the current one is wrong, because the current one was built for a drought that is ending. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific narrowing your channel has undergone. The cup that was shaped by the drought was shaped by the drought's volume, which was nothing. And a cup shaped by nothing is a cup whose capacity was reduced to match the nothing it was holding. The overflow that is approaching is not nothing. It is everything the dam accumulated during the nothing season. And everything that accumulated during nothing exceeds what a nothing-shaped cup can contain by a margin the cup cannot process. The margin is the overflow, and the overflow is the blessing that spills past the narrowed walls. My child, the instruction to bring a bigger cup is the most practical spiritual instruction a person in your position can receive, because the instruction acknowledges both the reality of the drought and the reality of the flood, and asks the person standing between the two to adjust their container from drought-calibrated to flood-calibrated before the water reaches the narrowing. The water is at the edge of the narrowed section right now, my beloved child, and the first drops entering the constricted portion of the channel are producing a sensation the dry bed has not processed since the drought began, because the bed forgot what water feels like after carrying dust for this long. I need you to feel the proximity of the flood, not the distant, upstream, someday the dam will release proximity that the drought season produced as background static. The present tense, water at the edge, first drops entering, dry bed being moistened proximity of a volume that has traveled the full distance from the dam to the narrowing and is now making contact with the specific section of the channel whose walls were constricted by the pain the drought installed. The first drops just arrived, and the bed is remembering. My dear one, everything has been building toward this edge. The drought that narrowed the channel, the wanting that constricted at the bedrock level, the comparison that produced the verdict, the pain that wore wisdom's language, the dam that accumulated the withheld volume, the release that was authorized one narrowing before closure, the humidity that announced the water's approach, the wider sections that filled first, and now the edge, the specific channel level, water meets narrowing point, where the volume that was released upstream encounters the width that was reduced downstream. The encounter is happening right now, and the encounter is revealing this mismatch. My child, the water is pressing against the narrowed walls, not violently, persistently. The volume is wider than the channel. The flow is larger than the passageway. And the mismatch between what was released and what the narrowing can receive is producing the specific, physical. The water is here and the walls are too close sensation that tells the channel maintainer the instruction to widen was not a suggestion. It was the preparation for exactly this moment. Type water arrived if the first drops just entered the narrowed section of your channel, and the dry bed is remembering what water feels like for the first time since the drought began, and the mismatch between the volume released and the width maintained is producing the undeniable sensation that the instruction to bring a bigger cup was preparation for exactly this moment. The water just exceeded the walls. The channel is overflowing, and the volume that the dam released upstream is now pouring past the narrowed edges of a passageway whose drought-shaped width cannot contain what the flood season God just sent downstream. My beloved child, this is the moment. The moment the cup that was shaped by the empty season encounters a volume that was accumulated during the empty season, and the two meet and the volume wins. The moment the narrowed walls feel the water rise past the edges the pain installed, and the overflow begins spilling into territory the narrow channel was never designed to reach. The overflow is happening. Right now, feel the water exceed the walls. The cup you thought was empty is about to overflow. Bring a bigger one. The title just completed its prophecy. The cup was not permanently empty. The cup was temporarily unfilled during a drought, whose dam was holding back a volume so large that the cup the drought shaped cannot contain even a fraction of what is now being released. The overflow is not the failure of the cup, it is the success of the dam. And the success of the dam is measured not by what the cup holds, but by what the cup cannot. My child, the overflow is the blessing, not the fill. The fill is what matches the container. The overflow is what exceeds it. And a God who releases at overflow volume rather than fill volume is a God whose provision is measured by the excess rather than the adequacy. The excess is yours. The water that spills past the narrowed walls is not waste. It is the provision that the drought-shaped cup was too small to contain, reaching the areas of your life the narrow channel was not directing it toward. The overflow is the provision finding its own paths, wider paths, paths the narrowed channel could not have directed it toward, because the narrowed channel was only aimed at the areas the drought-level expectations had identified as realistic. The overflow reaches what the narrow cup never could. Now that the water is overflowing the narrowed walls, everything about the drought-shaped container that governed your capacity for receiving is being permanently expanded by a volume that does not negotiate with the walls the pain installed, my dear child. This is what happens when flood volume provision meets drought-calibrated capacity. The provision does not reduce itself to match the container. The provision expands the container to match the volume. The walls that were constricted by the pain of the empty season are being pushed outward by the pressure of the water pressing against them. Not violently, not destructively, but with the specific, sustained, I am wider than you are pressure that a volume larger than its channel naturally produces. The walls are widening, not because you chose to widen them, because the water is wider than the walls. My beloved child, the expansion is restructuring your capacity at the wanting level, the bedrock dimension where the most dangerous narrowing occurred. The water is not only pressing the walls of expectation outward, it is pressing the bed of wanting wider. And the bedrock expansion is the deeper restructuring, the one that changes the foundation the entire channel is built on, from a drought-width foundation to a flood-width foundation. The wanting is widening for the first time since the narrowing began, and the widened wanting produces a different relationship with desire than the narrowed wanting could sustain. A person whose wanting was narrowed by drought approaches desire cautiously, permitting themselves to want only what the narrow channel could deliver. A person whose wanting is being widened by flood approaches desire differently, permitting themselves to want at the width the water is demonstrating is available. The water is demonstrating availability, and the demonstration is wider than anything the drought allowed you to want. Type wanting widening if the flood volume provision is pressing the walls outward at the bedrock level, widening the wanting that was constricted by the drought, and the expansion is restructuring your capacity for desire from drought width to flood width, because the water is demonstrating an availability wider than anything the empty season permitted you to want. Let me show you what your life looks like now that the water is flowing through an expanding channel and the overflow is reaching areas the narrow passageway could never have directed it toward. Because a person whose channel just transitioned from drought width to flood width receives at a volume the narrowed version could not have processed. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the daily provision level. You have been receiving at the trickle rate, the minimum viable, just enough to sustain drought-calibrated flow that the narrow channel permitted. The trickle sustained life. It did not fund expansion. It provided enough to maintain what already existed without producing the surplus that growth and new endeavors and forward motion require. The trickle just became a flow, and flow funds what trickle could not. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the narrow, the first conscious awareness of each day, calibrating the expectation to the drought-width channel, whose capacity determined what the day was permitted to bring. The calibration was automatic. Before the first decision of the day was made, the system had already restricted the incoming to the width the pain had installed. Tomorrow the system encounters a wider channel. The automatic calibration runs. But the width it encounters is no longer drought level. The system must recalibrate to a channel whose capacity has been expanded by the water's pressure. And recalibration to a wider channel produces a wider expectation for the day. Wider mornings, wider decisions, wider capacity for receiving what the day is bringing. The overflow is reaching areas your narrow channel never aimed at. Relationships the drought-width provision could not fund. Opportunities the trickle-rate flow could not sustain. Dimensions of your life that were dormant during the dry season because the narrow channel was not directing any provision toward them. The overflow does not need to be directed. It finds its own paths. And the paths it finds are the ones the narrowing abandoned. People are going to notice the overflow before you describe the dam. Because a person whose channel just expanded from drought width to flood width carries an atmospheric abundance that the trickle-sustained version could not produce, regardless of how gracefully the trickle-sustained version managed the scarcity. My beloved child, the ones who knew you during the dry season, who interacted with the narrow channel version, who sensed the constriction in your capacity to receive, and perhaps attributed it to personality rather than pain, who observed the downsized desires and the shrunk prayers and the quiet acceptance of less, and interpreted the acceptance as contentment rather than recognizing it as the drought-shaped container pain installed. Those people are about to encounter the overflowing version. They will say abundance looks different on you. They will mean the channel widened. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when their channel has been expanded by flood volume provision after a drought season. The quality is not the casual abundance of someone who has always received at high volume. It is the specific drought to flood, constriction to expansion. I know what empty feels like, and this is not it abundance, that only a person whose channel was narrowed by pain and widened by provision can carry. The quality is grateful overflow, and grateful overflow attracts differently than casual abundance. Connections that require the depth of grateful overflow to form are approaching the widened channel right now. There are partnerships and opportunities whose formation demands the specific atmospheric quality that only a person who has known the drought and is now experiencing the flood can produce. The quality that carries the contrast between the two seasons in a single presence. My dear one, the contrast is magnetic, because the contrast tells a story that casual abundance cannot tell. And the story attracts what the story resonates with. Type grateful overflow if you believe the expansion from drought width to flood width is producing an atmospheric quality that the trickle-sustained version could never carry. The specific drought to flood. I know what empty feels like grateful overflow that attracts connections whose formation requires the depth of contrast between the empty season and the overflowing one. I need you to understand why I held the volume behind the dam during the drought, rather than releasing it in a steady flow that would have kept the channel full throughout the season. My beloved child, Because the holding reveals something about the kind of provision I designed for your life that steady flow provision could never have produced. I could have released at a steady rate. The channel would have stayed full at its original width throughout the season. No drought, no narrowing, no pain-shape reduction in the wanting or the expecting, no comparison, no verdict, no near closure. A steady, predictable, always flowing channel that maintained its width because the flow justified the width at every point in the timeline. I chose the dam, and the dam required the drought. My child, steady flow provision produces a steady flow life, adequate at every point, sufficient in every season, predictable in its arrival, comfortable in its consistency. And comfort produces a specific relationship with the provision, the relationship of expectation rather than wonder. Expected provision is received without astonishment. Flood provision after drought is received with the specific, body level, overwhelmed by the volume astonishment that only the contrast between empty and overflowing can generate. I chose you for the astonishment, because the assignment embedded in your life requires a person whose relationship with provision carries the depth of contrast rather than the flatness of consistency. The assignment requires a person who knows what empty channels feel like, who has tasted the drought at the wanting level, and who receives the flood with the specific cannot be manufactured, only drought survivors carry. This quality of someone whose astonishment at the overflow is authentic because the memory of the empty bed is still fresh. My dear one, the astonishment is the quality, and the quality was only available through the dam method. Steady flow does not produce astonishment. Only drought to flood produces it. The doubt surfacing right now is using the most practical objection available. The voice that says expanding the channel before the water is visible is presumption, and that widening the wanting before the provision has materialized is setting yourself up for the specific disappointment the narrowing was designed to prevent, my child. It sounds like this. The instruction says bring a bigger cup, but the last time I held a big cup, it stayed empty, and the emptiness of the big cup was worse than the emptiness of the small one, because the size of the empty container is proportional to the size of the disappointment it produces. A small empty cup hurts less than a large empty cup, and widening the channel before the water is verified is volunteering for the large cup version of the disappointment the drought already administered at the small cup level. That doubt just used the memory of the empty big cup as evidence against the instruction to bring a bigger one. And the evidence fails against one upstream fact. My beloved child, the previous big cup was held during the accumulation phase, the phase when the dam was holding the volume rather than releasing it. Holding a big cup during accumulation produces the specific empty wide vessel disappointment the doubt is describing. But this instruction is not being given during the accumulation phase. It is being given during the release phase. And the release phase is mechanically different from the accumulation phase, because the water that was being held is now moving. The previous big cup was held before the dam opened. This big cup is being requested after the dam opened. Before is accumulation, after is release. And holding a big cup during a release is not presumption. It is preparation. The water is audible. The humidity has changed. The first drops have arrived. And bringing a bigger cup at this stage is not the setting up for disappointment the doubt is warning against. It is the practical obedience of a person who heard the water and believed it was real. Type after the dam if the doubt used the memory of a previous empty big cup as evidence against widening, and you now understand the previous big cup was held during the accumulation phase when the dam was still closed. And this instruction is being given during the release phase, when the dam is open and the water is already moving, and preparation is not presumption, but obedience. During every season of the drought, I was not downstream, watching the dry bed, from the position of a god whose dam was holding the volume without personal involvement in the experience. The holding was producing in the person maintaining the channel below. I was at both locations simultaneously, my beloved child, at the dam, managing the accumulation, monitoring the volume, calculating the release date, with the precision of an engineer whose dam holds what the downstream channel is not yet ready to receive. And at the channel, walking the dry bed beside the person whose narrowing I was watching with the specific ache of a god, who could see the volume accumulating upstream, while the person beside him could see only the dust beneath their feet. I carried the ache of both views. The volume I could see, the dust you could see. My child, there were days during the drought when I walked the dry bed with you, and you did not feel my presence because the dryness of the bed was so consuming that the detection system your spirit uses to register divine proximity was overwhelmed by the sensory input of the dust. The dust was louder than my footsteps, and footsteps drowned by dust are not absent. They are undetected. I walked every dry day, my feet in the same dust yours were in. The nights were the same. During the pillow seasons, and the narrowing seasons, and the comparison seasons, and the verdict seas, I was at the channel, not monitoring from the dam, but present at the bed, beside the person whose pain was installing the narrowing that the flood would eventually press back out. My dear one, I did not leave the channel during the drought to manage the dam from a distance. I managed the dam while walking the channel, because a God who operates outside the limitations of location does not choose between upstream and downstream. He occupies both. And occupying both means the person walking the dry bed was never walking it without the one whose dam was holding what the dry bed would eventually overflow with. I know the exact narrowing that was the most painful, the specific constriction that cost you more than all the others combined, because it was the narrowing at the wanting level where you stopped permitting yourself to desire the specific thing the dam was accumulating the most volume behind. My dear one, not the first narrowing, not the comparison narrowing, the wanting narrowing, the one that occurred at the bedrock of the channel, the foundational layer where the capacity for desire itself was being constricted by the specific grief of wanting something so deeply and receiving so little of it for so long that the wanting itself became the pain the narrowing was designed to eliminate. My beloved child, I know the specific thing you stopped permitting yourself to want. And I know it because the volume of water the dam accumulated behind the wall for that specific want exceeds the volume accumulated for every other dimension of the provision combined. The thing you stopped wanting most is the thing the dam held most for. The narrowing at the wanting level produced the most painful constriction, because wanting level narrowing does not merely reduce what you expect to receive. It reduces what you allow yourself to imagine receiving. And a person who has narrowed at the imagination level has constricted the channel at the dimension where the widening must begin, because a channel cannot be wider than the imagination of the person maintaining it. My child, the water that is pressing against the narrowed walls right now is pressing hardest at the wanting level constriction, the specific bedrock narrowing where the most painful reduction occurred. And the water pressing hardest at the point of most painful narrowing is the water that carries the highest volume, because the dam accumulated the most behind the wall for the thing the wanting abandoned. The God who knows what you stopped wanting most is the God whose dam held the most for it. Type deepest want if God just identified the specific thing you stopped permitting yourself to desire, and the volume of water the dam accumulated behind the wall for that exact want exceeds every other dimension of the provision combined, because the thing the wanting abandoned is the thing the dam held the most for. Now that the water is flowing and the walls are widening and the overflow is reaching areas the narrow channel never aimed at, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child. And it is the instruction the title has been carrying since the first word. Bring a bigger cup. Not maintain the drought-shaped container while the flood pours around it. Not hold the narrow vessel in the middle of an overflowing channel and receive at the capacity the pain installed. While the excess spills past the edges, the fear of disappointment is still maintaining. Bring a bigger cup. Set down the one the drought shaped, and reach for the container the flood requires. My child, bringing a bigger cup is a specific, practical act of obedience. It means widening the wanting back to its original width, the pre-drought, pre-narrowing, pre-comparison, pre-verdict width that the channel was originally designed at, before the first disappointment installed the first constriction. The original width is the bigger cup. Returning to the original width will feel dangerous, because the original width was the width that was empty during the drought, and the emptiness of the original width was the pain that initiated the narrowing. Returning to the width that was once empty feels like returning to the vulnerability the narrowing was designed to eliminate. But the conditions have changed. The dam is open, the water is flowing, and widening to the original width during a flood produces a different experience than maintaining the original width during a drought. The width is the same. The conditions are opposite, and same width under opposite conditions produces opposite results. Wide during drought equals empty pain. Wide during flood equals overflowing abundance. Set the small cup down. It served you during the drought. It cannot serve you during the flood. And the flood is here. The conditions changed, and the cup must change with them. You made it to the flood, my beloved child, and I need you to stand in the overflowing channel long enough to feel what it means to receive at a volume the drought convinced you was not available to a person maintaining a channel with your address. Feel the water, not the memory of the dust, not the residue of the drought that the dry bed days deposited in your system. The water, the specific, dam-released, flood volume, wall-widening, overflow-producing, drought-ending water that is filling a channel whose bed forgot what moisture felt like and whose walls are being expanded by a pressure that does not negotiate with the narrowing the pain installed. The water is here, and here feels like the opposite of everything the drought taught you to expect. I want to thank you for something the drought made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for maintaining the channel. Thank you for the narrowing, not because the narrowing was correct, but because the narrowing kept the channel open. A person who narrows is a person who is still maintaining. A person who walks away from the channel entirely is a person whose passageway cannot receive the flood when the dam opens. You narrowed, but you did not walk away, and the not walking away is why the water has a channel to fill right now. My dear child, thank you for the narrowing that was one constriction away from closure. Thank you for stopping at the threshold. Thank you for the last remaining width that was held open by a wanting so reduced it was barely detectable, but was never fully eliminated. Let the tears come, not drought tears, not empty channel tears, overflow tears. The tears of a person standing in a channel whose water just exceeded the walls the pain installed, feeling the volume that the dam accumulated during every dry season, pressing the wanting wider than the wanting has been since before the first narrowing. Type overflow tears if tears are forming right now, because you are standing in a channel whose water just exceeded the narrowed walls, and the volume the dam held during every dry day is pressing the wanting wider than it has been since before the drought began, and the tears are not grief, but the overwhelm of receiving at a volume the empty season convinced you was not available to your address. You are not the person holding the drought-shaped cup anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one who narrowed the channel with each disappointment, the one who reduced the wanting at the bedrock level, because the wanting was producing more pain than the wanting was worth, the one who compared their dry bed to full channels nearby and concluded the dam distributes by worthiness, the one who wore the narrowing as wisdom, when the narrowing was pain dressed in wisdom's language, the one whose channel was one constriction from closure when the dam opened at full release, and the water arrived at a volume the drought-shaped container could not hold. That identity was permanently retired the moment the water exceeded the walls, and the overflow reached areas the narrow channel never aimed at, and the wanting was pressed wider than the wanting had been since before. The first disappointment installed the first narrowing. You are the person holding the bigger cup now, and the bigger cup is filling the drought-shaped container that governed your capacity for receiving, your permission to desire, your expectation of provision, and your belief about whether the dam upstream held anything with your address on the release schedule has been permanently set down, not discarded with contempt, set down with gratitude. The small cup served you during the drought. It held the trickle that sustained what the drought would have consumed without any vessel at all. The small cup kept you alive during the dry season, and the small cup's service is honored by the bigger cup that replaces it. My dear child, the small cup was survival. The bigger cup is assignment. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a person whose God releases at dam volume, not a person who receives at trickle rate. Not a person whose channel was narrowed by pain into a passageway too constricted to hold what the dam was accumulating. A person whose channel has been widened by the water itself, pressed open by a volume that does not negotiate with the walls the drought installed, because the volume was determined by the dam rather than by the channel. The dam determines the volume, the channel determines the capacity. And the instruction to bring a bigger cup is the God who controls the dam, telling the person who maintains the channel to match their capacity to his volume, rather than matching their capacity to their drought. Match my volume, not your drought. That is the instruction that changes the container permanently. The water is flowing, the channel is widening, the wanting is expanding, the overflow is reaching every dimension the narrow passageway abandoned during the dry season. And the person standing in the flood with a bigger cup is not the person who stood in the drought with the small one, because the flood version carries the specific. Dam released, drought to overflow. I know what empty feels like, and this is the opposite quality that only a person whose channel was narrowed by pain and widened by provision can carry. The cup is bigger now, my beloved child, and the bigger cup is overflowing, and the overflowing will not stop, because the dam that was accumulating during every dry day of every dry season has been opened at a volume whose duration matches the duration of the drought, meaning the flow will continue for as long as the drought lasted, because the accumulation was proportional to the withholding, and proportional release runs for proportional duration. The drought lasted seasons, the overflow runs for seasons, and the person whose bigger cup is receiving the first volume of a seasonal overflow is receiving at a rate the small cup could never have held, and at a duration the small cup could never have sustained. Subscribe to this channel so that every time God opens the dam, upstream the instruction to bring a bigger cup reaches you before the drought-shaped container limits what the flood volume provision is trying to deliver. You are not someone who holds a small cup anymore. You are someone whose God releases at overflow volume and whose channel is being widened by the water itself. The next message carries the first overflow report from a life receiving at dam volume. and what the flood produces in the areas the narrow channel abandoned will prove that the drought was accumulation. The release is proportional, and the cup the pain shaped was always too small for what the God who controls the dam was holding behind the wall for you. Type bigger cup if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the drought was accumulation, not abandonment. The narrowing was pain, not wisdom. The dam opened at full volume. The water exceeded the walls. The wanting is being pressed wider. The overflow is reaching what the narrow channel abandoned. And the God who controlled the dam during every dry day is the same God standing in the overflowing channel beside you, confirming that what was held behind the wall was always yours, and the instruction to bring a bigger cup was always the most loving preparation a God could give to a person whose flood was about to exceed every container the drought had shaped.